and to tighten up the mix a little bit. So basically I tried a few different things with a few orchestrations, a few styles. We're gonna be talking about some of the goals of making a template like this. What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. The time has come for us to make a new template video. I do it every year at around the same time. The very first thing I need to say is that there isn't any sponsor of any kind. If I'm endorsing any product, is only because I like it. Nobody's paying me to promote the stuff or any funky business like that, and these videos are only possible thanks to my patrons. So if you're interested in supporting the channel, you can check that out. You don't have to, of course. I appreciate you being here in the first place. But what you get in return is a bunch of cool stuff, including this template. So let's jump straight in. This is a new template, or rather the old template that keeps, you know, getting updated with new stuff, and is not vastly different from the previous one. But there are a couple of differences. Mostly the balance. You know, I've been messing with the faders, you know, quite a bit to achieve a more natural balance. This is not necessarily more realistic than the previous template, and we're gonna be playing some examples later on. I've recorded some music just to show you how it sounds like. But yeah, it's much easier to work in this new template compared to the previous one. And you'll see that I pulled a couple of instruments here and there. The oboe, you know, minus 6 dB, and I'm using mostly, for the biggest part, cinematic studio stuff, which is meant to be already balanced, you know, and I think it's pretty good. You get a pretty realistic balance out of the box, but from a production standpoint, sometimes some of these instruments can sound a little bit harsh, and what I produce, you know, is mostly media music. I don't do concert music, so from a production perspective, you know, taming some of the harshness of these instruments like oboes and trumpets can make sense, you know. And reversely, I'm doing something similar for the lower instruments, like on the double basses, for example. If I grab this gain plugin, you see that I boosted them about 3 dB, and this is basically just so that I don't have to push the dynamics for them to be able to project, you know, because, you know, by using a higher dynamic, particularly on, you know, lower register instruments, you get like a bassier kind of, you know, harsher tone, which is not necessarily something that I want, contrary to something like brass, you know, that to get a brassier kind of, you know, brighter tone, you would have to push the dynamics. So it kind of makes sense to pull back a couple of dB, something like that, to make them sit, you know, more nicely. So as I said, for the vast majority, I'm using Cinematic Studio stuff. There are some new additions as well, but starting from the top, you see that I have Cinematic Studio Woodwinds. I love this library. I particularly like, you know, the low latency mode. Yeah, it's just great. They're very nimble, you know, very bright, but also quite expressive, you know, just the way I like them. And going in order, I'm not going to play every single instrument because, you know, but going in order, the following is my trusty, you know, sample modeling brass. I particularly like the horns. Actually, I believe the French horn is my favorite library in general because of how expressive it is. It's just, you know, amazing. I mean, it's just amazing. But bear in mind that, you know, it took quite a bit of processing to get to this sound. You know, I have quite a few effects on the channel strip and also in the general bass outputs. If I were to turn everything off, it would sound like this. I mean, It's just like very dry. You know, I believe these instruments were recorded in an anechoic chamber, which is basically like a room with no reflections. So yeah, basically to get this sound, you have to get rid to a lot of unwanted frequencies, that, you know, nasty proximity effect that you get from close miking instruments, and use some insert reverbs, and, you know, there's quite a bit of, you know, trickery going on. And actually, I think for the first time ever, I'm happy with the curves that I was able to draw. This is something that I have been tweaking since I got the library like 4 years ago, which is crazy. But finally, you know, I found this, you know, curves, and I really like how this instrument sounds now. I'm actually quite scared of touching them, you know, because I'm afraid I'm not gonna get to the same results again. And I'm kind of happy about the trumpets as well, but not quite as happy as I am with the French horns. So yeah, there's just something about it. It sounds a little bit more MIDI to me, but it kind of sits nicely with the rest of the brass section, which is from cinematic studio stuff. And also, I'm also using the tuba and the bass trombone from sample modeling, but it's hidden because I don't use it nearly as often as the other instruments. And for comparison, here's the, you know, solo horn from Cinematic Studio Brass. The one thing I don't like about this library is that, you know how I said before, for the woodwinds you have the low latency mode. You don't get that with the brass, and it is something I wish they did, because the built-in latency can make it so that it's much harder to play. I mean, you can probably tell that I was quite sloppy. I mean, like, I don't know how people get used to this. I never got used to playing with the latency. And also, for the sake of being thorough, I'm running this project, this template, with a buffer size of 256, which is quite low. And actually, before we forget, I always forget about mentioning what kind of Mac this is when I'm making these videos. So this is a new Mac. This is a MacBook M1 Max Pro 16-inch. With a memory of 64 gigs, and it's great because, you know, it's a laptop. So basically, this is allowing me to kind of bring work anywhere if I need to. Before I used to use an iMac from 2014, I believe, so it's kind of old now. I still use it. I'm using it right now as a secondary monitor, and that used to have 32 gigs of RAM, which is fine. You can run samples through it, but obviously having doubled the memory kind of makes quite a big difference in terms of how many samples I can run simultaneously, you know, how many mics I can load up and things like this. But yeah, overall, Cinematic Studio Brass, I love that. I particularly like the shorts. It's just very good, very detailed, very punchy as well. But once again, the latency with these libraries can make it so that, you know, it's difficult to play parts in. What helps though in Logic is a function called low latency mode that I have assigned to a custom key command. So basically, every time I press the P button, you'll see this little button over here on the top illuminating. And that kind of allows me to play the parts in with a little bit less latency. Bear in mind though that every time you do that, it kind of disables some of the plugins and some of the natural balance that you might have achieved by using some plugins like reverbs, compressor, things like this. So now, as you can see, I have the low latency mode enabled. And it's super easy to play these instruments. But if I disable it, of course, now the instrument sounds much nicer. I have, you know, all my processing back on, but there's a considerable difference in volume. Right in the middle of the template, I have some utility stuff like no output, click, sketch, and the piano I can grab and play every time I need. And also I have more stuff hidden. I can uncover with just by pressing the H button on my computer keyboard. And so, but what we have here is a reference track, something I can use for, I don't know, like a dialogue or temp or something like that, and more sketching tools that I don't use nearly as often. And also, because I know you will ask me for sketching, I'm using some of the native instrument stuff, you know, the Maverick piano. It sounds great. I love this. So yeah, I don't know, maybe redundant, wasting memory for instruments that are just used for sketching purposes, but I don't know, just using an instrument that sounds nice kind of inspires me to play differently in a way. So that's it for sketching. And proceeding down, I have a folder for ensemble patches, something that wasn't there in my previous template, but I find myself, you know, using more often recently. 3 subgroups, you know, something for runs and phrases, and pure ensemble patches, and some orchestral effects that I don't use as often, and that's why it's hidden normally. Starting with runs and phrases, these are things that I've had in my template before, like you know, Hollywood Wins from Cine Samples, which is just great and everybody uses it. There is quite a bit of reverb, actually. I think I may want to kind of pull that back a little bit. You see, I'm still making changes because, you know, it's a work in progress template. I'm gonna keep tweaking and tweaking forever. So, yeah, some runs, some rips, trills. I mean, normal stuff. And I also have more niche stuff, you know, from the very same library that I don't use nearly as often. But new addition to the template is these patches that are actually sampled instruments of my own that I recorded, that I made myself out of a recording session. So this is basically a combination of woodwinds and strings. If I turn the mod wheel all the way down, I just get strings. And if I turn it all the way up, I get strings and woods. And the reason why I made a little sample library out of these, you know, articulations is that, you know, I oftentimes use these particular orchestrations and, you know, they don't necessarily work as well with samples, you know. So I just figured I would use some of the extra time I had in a recording session to make some instruments out of it. So here's the following one. I have some stuff, you know, on the woodwinds. As you can see, it's 150. It was recorded at 150 BPM, so it's tempo synced, but it's gonna sound terrible at 100 BPM because, you know, it's quite a bit slower. So if I turn these up. So yeah, pretty common Disney type orchestration. Actually, let me play without the reverb so you can hear it a little bit better. But yeah, I mean, I'm quite happy with this, but bear in mind it's just a prototype, yes, so there's no GUI or anything. This is just something for myself, really. It's not like commercially available or anything. And I also have one more patch, recorded at 140 BPM. And yeah, I mean, not particularly impressive, but it works nicely in context with the rest of the instruments and the rest of the orchestra playing, essentially. What follows this is a bunch of normal ensemble patches, you know, CSS ensemble strings. I really, really like to use this with the Consordino switch on. it's just gorgeous. I really like this. And of course I have the very same ensamble patch for Cinematic Studio Brass, and I would use the same for the woodwinds, but they don't have one. So for that I'm using Holy Woodwinds. And I also have more stuff from Spitfire, Bernard Herrmann Composer Toolkit, mostly, you know, for playing things in octaves. And these instruments, they were sampled together, you know, like cellos and basses playing an octave apart. And this basically goes back to the idea of using pre-recorded runs and phrases and things like this to kind of add that extra layer of realism. Of course, I could do the very same thing with CSS, for example, that I use as my main strings library, but it wouldn't sound the same because these instruments are recorded separately. So yeah, I mean, it sounds fine, but you know, having the real thing, of course, is much better. Similarly, I have more things for violins, you know, playing, you know, in octaves. Same idea, and other combinations of instruments, you know, common combinations of instruments like low strings and horns. Or horns and trumpets in octaves once again. So I find myself using these patches most of the time in conjunction with the rest of, you know, the individual instruments. Following this, we have some orchestral effects, and these are once again instruments from Spitfire's Bernard Herrmann Composer Toolkit. Of course, it's a little bit more niche stuff, and these are things that I don't use nearly as often as the other instruments, and that's why the hidden. But they sound great, and it's something that is nice to have for the rare occasion that you need it. Following that, we have a new addition to the template. I was really excited about this. I wanted this library for a very long time, so I finally got, you know, over the Black Friday sale, Cineperc, which is just amazing. What I like about Cineperc is the room tone. You know, this library was recorded at Sony, which is famously flattering for percussion and brass instruments. And also something I wanted for a very, very long time was the ability to adjust the release on these samples, because particularly for percussion instruments, you tend to get a very long kind of ring out, a very long tail, and all that, you know, rumble can kind of build up and muddy the mix in a way. So having the ability to adjust the release helps quite a bit. I can show you the difference. So this is with the release all the way up. Even if I let go of the key, you still get that ring out. But if I adjust the release like so, I can make it more dramatic. As I let go of the key, the sound stops, yeah? So basically, I mean, that was a little bit extreme, I know, but if I bring back the reverb, I can achieve the very same kind of effect, you know, similar at least, without nearly as much of that low rumble building up. And of course, if I do want to have a longer kind of tail, I can still hold the keys. Or like this, maybe for a more realistic kind of effect. And that's more like the way a real timpanist would play. They would dampen the drum with a hand in order to not have that nasty kind of, you know, build up, yeah? So I basically ended up substituting all my instances of BBC with Cineperc. And also something I really like about this library is that, look at this, there's so many instruments. There's more instruments than you'll ever need. So I'm basically covered for life, I think. And yeah, so that's in a perk. Actually, I do still have one BBC patch, which is the cymbals. I really like this pre-recorded, cymbal roll. You do have the same kind of thing with Cineperk, but it doesn't sound the same. It sounds to me like it has a higher, it was recorded at a higher dynamic, and the crossfade is just a little bit strange to my ears. So I don't see myself using this as often as the BBC one. Yes, for Harp and Celeste, I'm still using BBC. I still haven't found a library that pleases me 100%, but this is fine, I guess. And then for pianos, I use quite a few of them. My new favorite one is Noir by Native Instruments. It came with the upgrade to Complete 11, I believe, along with so many other stuff that, I don't use nearly as often. I do use some of these, actually. I kind of like, in my free time to relax, to make like lo-fi beats and stuff. And some of these are quite useful. But, there's so many samples in here. Some of the synths are great, for atmospheric stuff. But I mostly upgraded to Complete 11 just to get Noir and Isotope Ozone 10, which I use as my main kind of effect for mastering. So here's the piano. It sounds very good. That's a no-brainer. I also really like this for effect, with a longer kind of tail. Yeah, and the rest of the stuff is basically things I've showed you in the past. Cine piano, the original felt piano from Spitfire Labs, and this is new actually. This Celeste from Sonokinetic, which I like using for less orchestral stuff. It sounds great when you put it together with a piano. Very nice and sweet. And these other niche kind of instruments are not particularly interesting. It's mostly stuff from the older, Spitfire Labs, like the harpsichord, like a toy piano. I have them still running in Contact, so it's not the new Labs, essentially. And last on the template, we have, of course, strings. For that, I use Cinematic Studio strings, which I love, particularly after the recent update where they introduced the low latency mode, and I run it, and this is a new addition to the template. I run it together with the solo strings as a layer. And what this layer does is basically adding a little bit of extra definition. So if I were to mute, the section, the solo violin sounds like this. It's just great. It's a great sound, yeah? But what it does in conjunction with the section is just adding a little bit of extra definition, You don't really hear it, but you feel it. And also, to my ears, it kind of makes the section sound a little bit smaller. I much prefer the sound of a chamber string orchestra. And I think adding, this solo violin on top of, the section kind of makes it sound like it's a smaller section, that you have less players available. And of course, I'm doing the same with all the string instruments. So here's the cellos, for example. It's just fantastic. It's a great sound. And the solo cello on its own sounds like this. Yeah, other than that, this is pretty much everything. And hidden, I have some of my older BBC stuff. I still enjoy using the longs, you know, Spitfire makes some great long articulation, in my opinion. I particularly like the flautando. Everybody loves the flautando. So that's pretty much everything. We're going to be playing some examples in just a second, and maybe just, you know, talk about the mixing aspect a little bit and some of the processing of these instruments. And just to finish it off, you know, what we have right here in the bottom is just uninteresting stuff I don't want to talk about. Is just prints and basses and my reverbs and stuff like that. So let's open a different project. There you go. So this is exactly the same template. And by the way, these little examples we're going to be playing in a second are also available on my Patreon. And yeah, it's exactly the same template, mixed the same way. And basically, I just recorded a bunch of different things to test the balance and to tighten up the mix a little bit. So basically, I tried a few different things with a few orchestrations, a few styles. And I'm going to be playing the first example, and then we're going to be talking about some of the goals, you know, of making a template like this. So I'm going to play you a second one with a slightly different orchestration. So the overall goal of this template was to make something that sounds, you know, dry and punchy, but also to sound like one, which is not something that is necessarily easy to do. I'm using as little reverb as possible. And this is also a new addition to the template. I just recently got this cinematic rooms plugin, which is great. I honestly got this only because everybody uses it, and I wanted to see what it was all about. But I'm loving this so far because it's really quite transparent, and you can tweak all the parameters just to make it sound just the way you want. And what I ended up doing is something basically like this, you know, like a 2 seconds tail, so not too long, and cutting out quite a bit of the highs because I don't want to hear too much of the room tone and some of the low mids as well. So if I were to press stop at any point, you can hear how subtle the tail of this reverb is. Yes, it's just to basically add a little bit of glue to all these instruments and to make them sound like one. Percussion maybe is an exception, you know, I tend to send a little bit more reverb to brass and percussion to make it feel like, you know, just sitting further back in the room. So, and what you see over here on bass 255 is an instance of 7 Heaven, which I still use. It was in my previous template and I'm still using it now. And that is, I'm sending 2 reverbs to percussion and some of the instruments just to basically give them more depth and further separation. And hopefully if I mute the percussion, you know, the orchestra is going to sound like one, you know, like big and resonant, but without necessarily having a lot of reverb. Once again, like brass is meant to be sitting further back in the room. So if I mute brass as well, like hopefully strings and woodwinds should sound like they're pretty much blending with each other. And this may be an orchestration thing, but it sounds a little bit more evident on the second example. And in terms of some of the EQ I have done is for the most part subtractive stuff. You'll see this cut in between 3K and 4K very often because, you know, it's to me, you know, that particular frequency spectrum makes things sound a little bit more synthetic. and you see me cutting a lot of that across a bunch of different instances. But yeah, for the most part, these are minor, adjustments that don't necessarily make a huge difference on their own, but they do stack up eventually. And if I were to turn off all the equalizers, you will get a much muddier kind of mix, of course. A new addition to the template is this Galfos plugin, which is going to be really hard explaining what it does, but it's basically some kind of dynamic EQ that allows you to either taming harsh frequencies or unwanted frequencies, or recovering things that were lost. I basically use this in a very subtle way, only taming frequencies about 20%. It goes all the way up to 200, so it doesn't do much, but it adds to me that extra level of clarity. And so let me just A/B a couple of times and show you what it does. And finally, to add, that extra touch of, texture, I'm using a little bit of saturation that compresses the sound a little bit as well, makes, the section sound a little bit more homogeneous, and some compression. And this is not really doing much, it's just basically reducing a couple of dB. So it just kind of takes the top off and makes the brass section sit in more nicely. And I'm doing something similar on percussion as well, because I don't want, percussion to poke out too much. So let's listen to some other examples. This is very different music. So lead on the woodwinds, and once again, what I tried after this was just basically copying and pasting across a bunch of different octaves and sections, and making sure that everything kind of works nicely. That was the same thing with the lead on the strings. Different key with the lead on the brass. So that was quite different actually. So basically we had the lead on the French horn and cellos and violas and some lower stuff as well, like the bassoons. Okay, and I have a couple of more examples for you in a different style, something slow and more mysterious. Finally, last thing to talk about, and I'm not going to spend forever on this because I think it's quite minor, but on the mix bus, we basically have a gain, which I tend to, change depending on how loud the music is, or loud or soft the music is. Then the same Galfos plugin we had before, both recovering 20% and taming 20%, but also I reduced the brightness by 30 because I find that stacking up this plugin, you know, many times kind of brightens the sound a bit too much for my taste. Then we have an EQ, this curve, you know, like a smiley brighty kind of thing. Some more compression, basically with the same setting as before, but with a different threshold, you know, so not compressing more than 2 dB and with a slow attack of 30 milliseconds and auto release on this SSL, you know, by waves. And finally, this Ozone 10 plugin that I mentioned before. For this, I'm using a little bit of vintage tape, you know, adding a little bit of saturation, you know, a mid-side EQ. These are the curves for the center channel, you know, not more than 2 decibels. And basically we have the reverse on the side channel. And then an imager, just, you know, to make the overall stereo image a little bit brighter, an exciter, adding a little bit more warmth with some texture, and a maximizer and a limiter, which are basically just 2 compressors. So quite a bit of compression, it may seem, but using compressors in different stages like this is not nearly as invasive as if you were to add compression all at once, you know, like, I don't know, like 6 dB of compression or on the mixed bass channel. That would be crazy. So I don't recommend that. Once again, this may not be like fully realistic, you know, but I'm not doing concert music here. I'm producing media music. And if you want to make sure that, you know, your music is not gonna get turned down too much, you don't really want it to be too dynamic, because if you think that they will ride, you know, the automations perfectly to kind of make your music sit under a dialogue and then come out and just, you know, that's never gonna be the case. If the music is too dynamic, they're just gonna turn it down and you're never ever gonna be able to hear it. It's harsh, but it's true. So that would be everything, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. I tried to answer, you know, some of the questions I get, you know, all the time. As I said before, this template alongside these examples and many other things I've shared in the past is available on my Patreon already, so you can check that out if you're interested. Thank you very much for watching. Subscribe if you're new to the channel, and I hope to see you very soon. Bye.